November 2nd, 1930. Addis Ababa Cathedral. Sunlight streams through stained glass, illuminating clouds of incense. A figure kneels to receive a crown of solid gold. 7 pounds of precious metal and centuries of divine authority settle onto Haile Selassie's head. In this moment, he becomes more than a man, King of Kings, elect of God, Lion of Judah. The ceremony has costed Ethiopia's entire yearly budget. But that's not the heaviest price, not even close. As the weight of the crown triggers his first headache, he has no idea that this moment of triumph is actually the beginning of his tragedy, that every step he takes to save his empire will only speed its transformation into a world that has no place for living gods. You might think being worshipped as divine meant having absolute power, but for Haile Selassie, it meant spending 44 years watching both his country and his divinity slip through his fingers until finally, alone in a servant's bedroom in his own palace, he would die at the hands of the very soldiers he had modernized. This is the story of a man who tried to guide an ancient empire into the modern world, only to discover that progress has no mercy, even for gods. Before we dive into this story, let me tell you about a different Haile Selassie. Not the divine emperor, but a young governor named Tafari Mekonnen, who in 1916 found himself regent of the world's oldest Christian kingdom. He was just 24, and he had a dream: to bring Ethiopia into the modern world while preserving its ancient soul. Ethiopia was unique, never colonized, heir to 3,000 years of history, tracing its royal line to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. But for young Tafari, this legacy was both a blessing and a curse. Over the next half-century, we'll see how his efforts to modernize Ethiopia ultimately destroyed him, how his divine status made human failures catastrophic, and how the very progress he championed would eventually imprison him. If you're fascinated by leaders caught between tradition and progress, hit subscribe. We're creating a whole series about monarchs who tried to modernize their ancient kingdoms and paid the ultimate price. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Let's start with young Tafari's first major decision as regent, establishing modern schools. Unlike other rulers who resisted change, he believed education was Ethiopia's path to greatness. But here's where things get tragic. Dr. Mehari Worku, an Ethiopian historian, explains, "Every student Selassie educated became both an asset and a threat. These young minds began questioning everything, including the divine right of kings." By 1923, Selassie was sending Ethiopia's brightest students abroad to study. One of his closest advisors warned him, "These students will return with dangerous ideas." Selassie reportedly replied, "Better dangerous ideas than dangerous ignorance." He couldn't have known that many of these same students would later lead the revolution against him. His modernization touched everything. He introduced Ethiopia's first constitution, created a modern army, established the first national bank, built the first national hospital, and even brought in the first cameras to document royal ceremonies. He gave Ethiopia its first airline, its first telephone system, its first modern postal service. But each reform chipped away at the very traditions that legitimized his rule. Even the roads he built made it easier for revolutionaries to mobilize against him. A former court official later recalled, he would approve modern reforms in the morning, then spend afternoons performing ancient ceremonies. You could see the strain in his eyes. Have you ever tried to change a system from within? Share your thoughts below about the challenges of being both a reformer and a traditionalist. But perhaps the most painful part of Selassie's story was how his divine status made every human failure catastrophic. In 1935, when Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia, Selassie did something unprecedented. He went to the League of Nations to plead his case personally. Standing before the world's powers, the elect of God became just another powerless leader begging for help. When the League failed him, it wasn't just a political defeat. It was a theological crisis. How could a divine emperor be so helpless? The exile years in Bath, England were even worse. Imagine being worshipped as a living god while living in a modest English house, reading reports of your people's suffering. One British journalist noted, "He would stand at his window for hours, holding letters from Ethiopia, tears running down his face." But the true shattering of his divine image came with the 1973 famine. Jonathan Dimbleby's ITV documentary showed the unthinkable, the King of Kings throwing scraps of food to starving subjects while his palace dogs ate well. The impact wasn't just local. Around the world, hundreds of thousands of Rastafarians who worshipped him as divine had to reconcile their faith with these images. Unlike other leaders who only had to worry about political reputation, Selassie's every human failing risked shattering people's religious faith. As one Ethiopian historian noted, he wasn't just failing as a ruler, he was failing as a god. If you're finding this exploration of power and divinity fascinating, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these important historical stories. But the ultimate tragedy of Selassie's story wasn't just his fall from power. It was that every tool used to destroy him was one he himself had introduced to Ethiopia. The modern education he championed created the intellectuals who questioned his rule. The army he modernized provided the force to overthrow him. Even the media he brought to his country became the means of his public humiliation. The 1960 coup attempt came from officers he had personally sent abroad for military training. He had to execute men he had mentored, signing their death warrants with the same pen he had used to sign their scholarship papers. The final overthrow in 1974 was even more ironic. The military committee that deposed him used radio, which he had introduced to Ethiopia, to announce his removal. State television, another of his modernization projects, broadcast evidence of his hidden Swiss bank accounts. His last months were spent under house arrest in his own palace, forced to watch state TV programs about his failures. The same television technology he had brought to educate his people now broadcasted his humiliation day and night. Guards reported that he would sit silently watching these programs, occasionally murmuring prayers in Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian liturgical language. On August 27, 1975, he was found dead in a servant's bedroom, possibly drowned in a toilet by his captors. A deliberately humiliating end for a man once worshipped as divine. Even in death, his body was denied proper imperial burial rites, secretly interred under a toilet until its discovery in 1992. If you've made it this far, you clearly appreciate deep dives into how progress and tradition collide. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because next week we're exploring another monarch who discovered that modernization is a force that devours even its champions. Remember, as Selassie's story shows us, sometimes the hardest thing isn't resisting progress. It's surviving the changes you yourself set in motion.